All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a virus you might not be familiar with, human metapneumovirus, or hMPV for short. We've got some great sources lined up for this deep dive, a
Mhm.
study from the China CDC Weekly, a couple of news articles from CNA and Euronews, and even a case study from the Microorganisms Journal.
Yeah, it's interesting. hMPV, it's been around for ages, decades even, but wasn't actually identified until 2001. Goes to show how much we still don't know about the viruses we're living with.
Makes you wonder what else is out there. So, our mission today, let's uncover everything we can about hMPV, the symptoms, why it seems to be spiking lately, and what it all means for, well, for you. Let's jump in with this case from the microorganism study. A 68-year-old guy gets severe hMPV pneumonia. And this is a guy who's an active runner.
Yeah, in this case, it really shows you hMPV isn't just some mild cold. This guy running 3 times a week, healthy otherwise. But his infection, it just escalated so fast. The study actually has a timeline of his symptoms, and it's pretty eye-opening. Shows just how quickly things can go downhill.
Makes you think twice about dismissing a cough as just a cold, huh? So, if even healthy folks can have these complications, who's really most vulnerable to hMPV?
The research is pretty clear on that. Young children, older adults, and anyone with a weakened immune system, they're most at risk for severe hMPV, which honestly is pretty typical for a lot of respiratory viruses.
Right. The CNA article, they mentioned that hMPV tends to be most active in late winter and spring, which is, well, right now. They even had some photos of hospitals in China completely packed, long lines, all because of this surge in cases.
Yeah, those pictures are definitely a bit worrying.
hmm
And this whole seasonal pattern, it actually raises some questions about how COVID-19 plays into all this.
Yeah, that COVID connection really jumped out from these sources. Like the China CDC weekly study, they found a huge spike in hMPV cases back in November 2020. Positivity rate over 40%.
Wow, that's significant. Hard to ignore a jump like that. Some researchers are thinking that maybe all the COVID interventions, lockdowns, social distancing, might have actually messed with the usual transmission patterns of other viruses, like hMPV. There's a study, the Frontiers in Cellular and Infection Microbiology study, it specifically talks about this, suggests that maybe we had a buildup of susceptible people during the pandemic.
So are we saying all the things we did to protect ourselves from COVID, maybe they made it easier for other viruses to spread? It's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
It is a complex situation, that's for sure. We're just starting to understand how the pandemic has reshaped the viral landscape. One thing we do know is that hMPV and other respiratory viruses, they spread in similar ways, mainly through these respiratory droplets.
Which means all those precautions we learned, hand washing, masking up, staying home when sick, they're still super important, right? Not just for COVID, but for hMPV and other viruses too.
Absolutely. Those basic hygiene practices, they're our first line of defense, really. But knowing what to look out for, that's key too. So let's talk about symptoms. What does hMPV actually look like?
From what I gathered from these articles and studies, it seems like a mixed bag. Cough, fever, stuffy nose, shortness of breath. It sounds a lot like the flu or even just a regular cold.
Yeah, and that's the tricky part. It's really hard to tell hMPV apart from other respiratory illnesses just by looking at the symptoms, which is where a proper diagnosis comes in.
Right. The microorganism study, they really stress the importance of those molecular tests, like the PCR test, to actually pinpoint if it's hMPV. Seems like those tests are crucial because just going by symptoms, well, that could lead to a misdiagnosis pretty easily.
Exactly. The study actually argued that these molecular tests should be part of the routine clinical workflow, especially for patients with pneumonia. Having a definitive diagnosis, it allows doctors to tailor the treatment and manage the patient much more effectively.
So let's dig a little deeper into this hMPV world. I got really interested in this whole discussion about genotypes and subtypes in the China CDC weekly study. They were looking at how these different strains of hMPV have been circulating over time.
Yeah, they found this fascinating pattern, almost like an alternating dominance between hMPVA and hMPDB. They called it AAABVA from 2017 to 2022, like a viral dance, different strains taking turns leading.
That's a great way to put it. But does this shifting pattern actually matter? Does it affect how the virus acts or how it spreads?
That's a great question, and honestly, that's something researchers are trying to figure out right now. The study also pointed out this one variant, A2C111C DUP, it's become the main strain of hMPVA. What's interesting about this variant is that it's got this larger duplication in its genetic code. Now, I know genetics can get a bit complicated.
No worries, I'm all ears. I find this stuff fascinating, even if it gets a bit technical.
Okay, well, this duplication basically extends the part of virus that attaches to our cells. So potentially, it could be making it better at infecting us. And the study suggests that this could even be linked to more potential glycosylation sites.
Okay, hold on. Got to break that down for me. What exactly is glycosylation and why should we care?
You're right, sorry for the jargon. Glycosylation, it's basically adding sugar molecules to proteins. And when it comes to viruses, these sugar molecules, they act like a disguise, help the virus evade our immune system.
So it's like the virus is wearing camouflage to sneak past our defenses.
Exactly. And the study suggests that this A2C111T variant might be particularly good at this, which could explain why it's become so dominant. It really highlights how important it is to understand these tiny genetic details, especially when we're trying to develop vaccines and treatments that actually work.
Wow, it's amazing how these like tiny little changes in a virus's genes can have such a huge impact on how it behaves, how it spreads.
It really is, yeah. And as we've been talking about, understanding these genetic changes, it's so important for figuring out how to, well, how to combat hMPV effectively.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that. Where are we now with treatment and prevention? What can people actually do?
Well, the tough part is there's no specific antiviral for hMPV yet.
Mhm.
So treatment right now, it's really focused on just managing the symptoms and helping your body's immune system fight it off.
So basically, like we do with the flu or a cold, right? Rest,
Right.
fluids, maybe some over-the-counter stuff for the fever and congestion.
Exactly. But for those severe cases, especially in,
Yeah.
those high-risk groups we talked about, they might need to be hospitalized.
Mm.
For respiratory support, managing complications like pneumonia.
Makes sense. And what about preventing it in the first place? We've talked about the hygiene stuff, but anything else people can do?
Well, the CNA article did mention that there are some efforts to develop an hMPV vaccine, which would be, I mean, that would be huge.
Yeah, a vaccine would be a game changer, especially for those most at risk. But until then, it's all about those tried and true preventative measures.
Exactly, and I think it's important to remember those measures. Hand washing, masking, staying home when you're sick. It's not just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting everyone around you, too.
It's that whole like collective responsibility thing, right? Knowing that our actions, they can really affect the health of others.
Exactly, and it's a good reminder that even though COVID might not be dominating the headlines anymore, the lessons we learned about public health, about infection control, those are still so important.
Totally. We've all gotten this like crash course in how viruses spread and how connected we all are when it comes to health.
And that awareness, it's going to be crucial as we face, well, not just hMPV, but whatever new viruses might pop up in the future.
I'm curious about that, what the future holds for hMPV. Do researchers have any like predictions about how this virus might evolve?
It's a tough question. Predicting viral evolution is
Yeah.
kind of like predicting the weather.
Yeah, there are always those unexpected twists and turns.
But based on what we've seen so far, it's likely that hMPV will stick around, maybe in those cyclical patterns we talked about earlier.
So we might see those waves of hMPVA and hMPVB kind of taking turns each year.
It's a possibility, and we might also see new variants popping up. Viruses are constantly mutating, adapting. It's in their nature.
It's like this constant evolutionary arms race.
Exactly, and that's why ongoing surveillance and research are so crucial. By tracking the genetic changes and how hMPV is spreading, scientists can stay one step ahead, and develop effective strategies to deal with it.
And what about the long-term effects of the COVID pandemic on hMPV and other respiratory viruses? We touched on this before, but could you unpack that a bit more? What are researchers looking into?
Sure, one area of focus is understanding how those pandemic disruptions, to viral transmission, how that might have changed immunity levels in people.
So because we were exposed to fewer viruses overall during those times of social distancing and isolation, can that make us more susceptible now?
That's one theory, yeah.
Yeah.
Researchers are looking into whether those reduced exposures led to, like, a dip in immunity, which could make people more vulnerable to infections like hMPV.
It's fascinating, but kind of worrying too.
I get it, but it's also important to remember, our immune systems are complex. They're adaptable, even if there have been some changes. Our bodies can still put up a fight against these viruses.
That's good to hear. And I imagine vaccines would play a big role in boosting immunity too.
Absolutely. Vaccines are amazing tools for training our immune systems to recognize and fight specific viruses. So getting an hMPV vaccine, if and when it's available, that would be a huge step forward in protecting individuals and communities.
Speaking of communities, I think it's important to talk about the psychological side of all this. We've been through a lot with COVID, and now we have this other virus on the rise. It's understandable if people are feeling, I don't know, anxious or overwhelmed.
You're absolutely right. It's so important to acknowledge those feelings and to prioritize mental health just as much as physical health.
So what would you say to people who are feeling stressed or anxious about all this hMPV stuff?
First thing, stay informed, but don't go overboard with the news. It's easy to get sucked into that constant stream of information, and that can just make anxiety worse.
So find that balance between staying in the know and protecting your mental well-being.
Exactly, and focus on what you can control. We've talked about those preventative measures, good hygiene, staying home when sick, getting vaccinated when a vaccine is available. Taking those actions, it can give you back some sense of control.
I like that, focusing on what you can do instead of feeling helpless.
And don't be afraid to reach out for support if you need it. Talk to friends, family, a therapist, whatever feels right. Sharing your worries, connecting with others, that can make a huge difference.
That's such good advice. We're all in this together. Supporting each other is so important, physically and emotionally.
Absolutely. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about hMPV, the better we can navigate this whole situation. With confidence and resilience.
You got that right. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's recap. What are the most important things people should remember about hMPV?
Okay, big picture. hMPV is common. It's a respiratory virus. Can cause a range of symptoms, from mild cold-like stuff to serious infections like pneumonia.
And while it can affect anyone, young kids, older adults, those with weakened immune systems, they're the ones who are most at risk.
Exactly. We also know that hMPV is circulating right now, and there's no specific treatment yet.
But those basic hygiene practices, hand washing, masking, staying home when you're sick, those can really help lower the risk of getting infected.
Absolutely. And there's no vaccine yet, but research is ongoing, so hopefully a vaccine will be available sometime in the future.
So stay informed, take those preventative steps, and be proactive about your health.
That's the key takeaway. And if you have any concerns, talk to your doctor. Don't hesitate.
Well said. And I just want to say to everyone listening, it's okay to feel a whole mix of emotions about this. We've been through a lot these past few years. It's natural to feel anxious or uncertain.
You're right. Acknowledging those feelings is important. And taking care of our mental health, it's just as important as taking care of our physical health.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we learn about hMPV, the better equipped we'll be to get through this with confidence and resilience.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time for us to take a deep breath and wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today, but before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, something based on what we've discussed so far.
I'm all ears.
So we know hMPV has been around for a while, but it's only recently gotten all this attention because of these unusual surges, right? Does that make you wonder if there are other viruses out there, ones we're not even aware of yet, that could pose similar threats in the future?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's something that's keeping researchers up at night. The world of viruses, it's vast, it's complex, and there's still so much we don't know.
It's a reminder that we need to stay vigilant, keep investing in research, and be ready to adapt to new challenges, whatever they might be.
Exactly. And by working together, sharing what we know, supporting each other, we can face these challenges head on and create a healthier future for everyone.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been taking a close look at hMPV, this virus that's been, well, kind of making waves lately with these unusual surges.
Yeah, and as we've seen, hMPV can be a bit tricky. It often looks like other respiratory illnesses, kind of a chameleon in that way.
Right, you can't always tell it apart from a cold or the flu just by the symptoms.
Exactly. That's why those molecular tests we talked about, they're so important for getting a clear diagnosis.
It's pretty amazing how these tiny viruses can cause such a variety of symptoms and affect people of all ages, you know?
Yeah, it really shows how complex our immune systems are and how viruses and their hosts, it's this intricate dance between them.
As we wrap up our deep dive today, there's something I've been thinking about. We've talked about the potential long-term effects of the COVID pandemic on hMPV and other respiratory viruses too. Do you think this could be like a preview of what's to come? Could we be looking at more unpredictable viral seasons in the future?
It's a possibility, that's for sure. And it's something researchers are keeping a close eye on. The pandemic, it definitely threw a wrench in the usual viral transmission patterns. And we're still figuring out what all the consequences of that might be.
It makes you wonder if we're like entering this new era of infectious diseases where viruses are behaving in ways we haven't really seen before.
I get that. But it's also important to remember that viruses are always evolving. They're always adapting. It's not a new thing, but The pandemic, it definitely put a spotlight on it, made us all more aware.
That's true. We've all become a lot more tuned into global health and how connected it all is.
Exactly. And that awareness is going to be crucial moving forward. Staying informed, being proactive about our health, supporting research, all of that is key to understanding and dealing with these viruses.
Speaking of research, what are some of the main things scientists are focusing on when it comes to hMPV?
Well, vaccine development is a big one, as we've talked about. Having a vaccine would be a major breakthrough for prevention, especially for those who are most at risk for serious complications from hMPV.
Absolutely. And what about treatments? Are there any promising directions researchers are looking at?
We don't have a specific antiviral for hMPV yet, but the research is ongoing. Scientists are looking at potential targets for antiviral therapies. That could help reduce the severity of the illness and how long it lasts.
That's good to hear. It sounds like there's a lot of effort going into tackling this virus.
There is, and I think it's important to highlight the collaboration happening here. Scientists all over the world, they're sharing data, expertise, resources. It's a global effort to understand hMPV and develop effective ways to fight it.
It's a reminder that even with these global health challenges, collaboration and knowledge sharing, those are our strongest weapons, really.
I completely agree. And as we've said throughout this whole deep dive, knowledge is power. The more we know about hMPV, the better prepared we'll be to protect ourselves and our communities.
And I think it's important to give our listeners some practical advice, too. Some key takeaways they can actually use in their everyday lives to stay healthy.
Absolutely. The foundation is those basic hygiene habits. Hand washing, masking, staying home when you're sick, these simple things. They make a huge difference in stopping the spread of hMPV and other respiratory viruses.
It's easy to forget about those basic things, but they're really our first line of defense.
You got it. And beyond hygiene, it's about being proactive about your health. Stay up to date on health advisories, know your risk factors, and don't hesitate to talk to your doctor if you have any concerns.
It's about taking charge of your health, being an active participant in your well-being.
Exactly. And remember, we're not in this alone. There are so many resources out there. Healthcare professionals, public health organizations, scientists working hard to protect our health. We can tap into all of that.
That's a great point. It's about using those resources and leaning on the collective knowledge and support of our communities.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to come up for air from our deep dive into the world of hMPV.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners have learned a lot and gained a better understanding of this, well, kind of mysterious virus.
I hope so too. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay healthy.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. And until next time, keep exploring.